They laughed when the old veteran inherited his uncle's broken-down fishing boat, until his dog tore through the rotted floorboards and found $340 million that no one in the family knew existed. Thomas Guthrie hadn't planned on going to the reading of the will. He hadn't planned on much of anything lately. Since coming home from his third tour in Iraq 12 years ago, planning had felt like something other people did. People with cleaner futures. People whose hands didn't shake when a truck backfired on the highway. He lived alone in a single-wide trailer on the edge of Harlan County, Kentucky. The land was his, 2.5 acres of mostly mud and pine, and he'd paid for it with the last of his discharge money back in 2011. The trailer had come with the property, which said everything about the state it was in. The roof sagged on the eastern side. One of the kitchen windows had been patched with electrical tape for 3 winters running. But it was his, and Thomas Guthrie had learned long ago that owning something, even something, broken, was better than owing someone else for something whole. His dog, Cooper, was an 8-year-old Belgian Malinois that the army had retired alongside him. Technically, Cooper's working life had ended after a roadside device outside of Fallujah had clipped his right ear and left a faint tremor in his back left leg. The army called it an honorable discharge with medical separation. Thomas had called it, "You're not leaving without me." He'd signed the adoption paperwork the same afternoon. Cooper wasn't fast anymore, but he was precise. He still moved through a space the way he'd been trained to move through a vehicle checkpoint or a suspect building. Low, methodical nose working the air in slow arcs. Thomas sometimes watched him sweep the trailer in the mornings, clearing rooms out of pure habit, and thought that some things don't unknow themselves. They just find somewhere quieter to keep doing what they always did. The call about the will came from a lawyer in Knoxville named Patterson. He left a voicemail that Thomas listened to twice before understanding what it meant. Gerald Guthrie, Thomas's uncle, a man he hadn't spoken to in almost 9 years, had died quietly at 78. No funeral announcement, no family notice. Just a lawyer with a calm voice and an appointment time. Thomas called back because he felt he should. He didn't expect anything. Gerald Guthrie had never been close family. He had been a hard man, the kind who kept his opinions shorter than his sentences, and his sentences shorter than most people's patience. He had run a small timber operation in East Tennessee for decades, sold it sometime in the 90s, and then mostly disappeared from the family's memory. The last time Thomas had seen him was at a cousin's wedding. Gerald had sat at the end of a table alone, and left before the cake was cut. What Thomas didn't know, what none of them knew, was what Gerald Guthrie had done with his money after the sale. The will reading was held in Patterson's office in downtown Knoxville, 3rd floor of an old building on Gay Street, the kind that still had original wood floors and smelled faintly of pipe tobacco that hadn't been smoked in decades. Thomas arrived wearing his cleanest shirt and his least scuffed boots. He left Cooper in the truck, with the windows cracked and a bowl of water on the seat. The others were already there when he walked in. His cousin Darlene sat near the window with her husband, a heavy-set man named Keith, who sold insurance in Chattanooga and had a habit of nodding at everything, as though he'd already heard it before. Darlene was Gerald's niece on the other side, through Gerald's first wife's sister, which made the connection thin enough that Thomas had to think about it twice. She had dressed well for the occasion. So had Keith, Gerald's neighbor's son, a man named Phil who had apparently run errands for Gerald in his final years, sat near the door. He looked uncomfortable and kept checking his phone. Thomas found a chair near the back wall and sat down. Patterson entered, set a leather folder on the desk, and cleared his throat the way lawyers do when they want the room to understand that what follows is not a conversation. He began with the property, a small cabin in Sevier County. Gerald's primary residence for the last 12 years went to Darlene, the proceeds from a savings account, modest, maybe $40,000, split between Darlene and Phil. A 1972 Ford pickup truck and various tools from the property Went to a local mechanic Gerald had used for 30 years. Thomas sat quietly. Patterson turned a page. To Thomas Allen Guthrie, he said, Gerald Guthrie bequeaths the fishing boat currently stored in the carport at the Sevier County property. A 1963 Chesapeake lapstrake, registry number TN4417. Darlene blinked. Keith looked at the ceiling. Phil stifled something that wasn't quite a laugh. Patterson continued reading without expression. Thomas looked down at his hands. A fishing boat. He didn't fish. He hadn't been on open water since a river crossing in Mosul that he'd spent years trying to forget. He didn't even own a truck capable of towing anything. On the drive back into the parking lot after the reading, Darlene found him near his truck. She meant well. He knew that about her even on her worst days. You can just leave it, she said. The boat? I don't mind if you leave it at the property. Nobody's going to want a 60-year-old wooden boat, Thomas. It probably doesn't even float. Keith stood behind her with his hands in his pockets, nodding. Thanks, Thomas said. I'm serious. It's not worth hauling anywhere. Just leave it. Thomas looked at her for a moment. It was his, he said. He left it to me. Darlene pressed her lips together. Okay, she said finally. Okay. He drove the 3 hours back to Harlan County with Cooper asleep across the back seat and the windows down because the heater ran hot. Outside, the mountains of East Tennessee shifted slowly into the coal country hills of Kentucky. The light changed the way it always did out here. Gold first, then gray, then gone. Thomas kept his eyes on the road. He'd gone to that reading expecting nothing, which was what Gerald had always given him. So the boat made a strange kind of sense, he supposed. An old broken thing for an old broken man. He almost laughed. Almost. He went back 2 weeks later with a borrowed flatbed trailer and a come-along strapped in the truck bed. Cooper rode up front, alert the way he always was on long drives, watching the road like it owed him something. The cabin in Sevier County was a modest place, maybe 800 square feet, backed up against a hillside with a stand of white oaks that dropped acorns across the roof every fall. The carport was attached to the side. A simple structure of pine posts and corrugated metal that had been built sometime in the 70s and repaired every decade since with whatever was on hand. The boat sat inside it. It was a lapstrake hull, maybe 19 feet, built from overlapping planks of white cedar that had once been sealed and painted but were now checked and gray. The transom had a crack running through it about 8 inches long. The gunwales were soft in 2 places. The keel had a ding near the bow that looked old enough to have its own history. Thomas stood looking at it for a long time. Cooper jumped down from the truck and went straight to the boat. He moved around it the way he moved around anything new. One slow circuit, nose tracing the air in steady passes. He went around the bow, along the port side, around the stern. Then he stopped. He was standing at the stern, near the transom, his nose pressed against the hull just below the waterline strake. His ears were forward. His tail had gone still. Thomas watched him. Cooper sniffed the same spot again. Then he sat down in front of it and looked back at Thomas with the particular expression that Thomas had learned, over 12 years, meant, I found something. I don't know what it is. But it's here. What is it, boy? Cooper looked back at the hull. Thomas crouched beside him. He ran his hand along the strake where the dog had been sniffing. The wood felt ordinary, old, dry, slightly rough at the edge of one plank. He knocked on it with his knuckle. The sound came back shallow, not quite right. He knocked again, moved 2 inches to the left, knocked a third time. The tone changed. He stood slowly. Then he found Gerald's toolbox on a shelf near the back of the carport and brought back a flashlight and a flat-blade screwdriver. He shined the light along the seam between the bottom plank and the strake above it. He almost missed it. It was that fine. A hairline gap, maybe 4 inches long, running in a straight line that didn't match the natural curve of the wood. Not a crack, a seam, deliberate, cut with intention. Cooper didn't move from his spot. Thomas pressed the screwdriver blade into the gap. He felt resistance, then a faint give. He worked it gently along the line. There was a soft mechanical sound, not a creak, more like the release of a held breath. and a section of the hull planking shifted inward. Not a plank, a door. He pulled it open. Inside, running the length of the section between two hidden frames, was a sealed compartment. The inside surface was lined with what looked like oilcloth, thick and old, pressed flat against the sides, and fitted tightly inside that compartment. Wrapped in wax paper, sealed with rubber bands that had aged to the color of rust, were bundles. Dozens of them. Thomas reached in and pulled one out. He untied the rubber band carefully. The wax paper came apart in his hands. Inside were bills. Old but clean. Hundreds, stacked tight as a deck of cards. He sat back against the hull of the boat and held the bundle in both hands without moving for a long time. Cooper leaned against his leg. Thomas exhaled. "Gerald," he said quietly, "what did you do?" He didn't search the compartment further that day. He closed the door back into the hull, pressed it until the latch caught, and stood up. He loaded the boat onto the flatbed in the last hour of afternoon light, taking his time with the tie-downs, checking every strap twice the way the Army had taught him to check anything that mattered. He drove back to Harlan County in the dark, Cooper asleep across the back seat again, and said nothing out loud for the entire 3.5 hours. He needed to think before he did anything else. Back at the trailer, he unloaded the boat under the single security light, mounted on the telephone pole at the edge of his property. He covered it with a tarp and tied the tarp down. Then he went inside, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and began working through what he knew. Gerald had sold his timber operation in the late 90s, a business that had operated in 3 counties for 30 years. Thomas had no idea what it had sold for. The family had never been the kind of family that talked about money, especially Gerald's money. But a timber operation that size, in that decade, in those counties, it would not have sold small. Thomas turned his coffee cup in his hands. Gerald had been alone for the last 12 years. No family visits, no known investments that anyone had mentioned. A modest cabin, an old truck, a fishing boat in the carport. A fishing boat that no one in the family had wanted, that no one had looked at twice. He went back out to the boat the next morning. Cooper was already at the door before Thomas had pulled on his boots. The dog's nose found the compartment seam in under 20 seconds. Thomas opened the door. It took him 2 hours to count. The compartment ran further than he'd estimated. 8 feet of hidden internal space, lined with oilcloth and stacked, floor to ceiling, with wax paper bundles. Each bundle held $10,000. He counted bundles, did the math, recounted, and sat on an overturned bucket, with his hands on his knees for a very long time. $340 million. He said the number out loud once, just to hear if it sounded real. It didn't. Inside the last section of the compartment, flat against the rear frame, was an envelope. His name was written on it, in a hand he didn't recognize as Gerald's at first, steadier than he would have expected, careful, like someone who had written the same letter in their head many times before finally putting it to paper. He opened it. "Thomas, if you're reading this, then you did the one thing I was counting on. You took the boat when everyone else told you it wasn't worth taking. You always did have better sense than most people gave you credit for, and a better spine than most people I've known in 80 years of living." He read slowly. "I didn't trust the others with this. Not because they're bad people. Because money changes what people think they deserve. And I didn't want to watch that happen to this. I spent 30 years building what I built, and I knew what I wanted done with it. I just needed to find the right person to trust with the decision." Thomas stopped at a line near the bottom of the page. "I watched you come home from that war and not ask anyone for a thing. That told me what I needed to know. Do something that lasts, Gerald." He folded the letter and held it between both palms. Outside the trailer window, the morning was still and gray. Pine trees at the edge of the property barely moved in the wind. Cooper sat beside him and pressed his shoulder into Thomas's knee. Thomas sat there for a long time. He knew even then that discovery was only the first part of this, because he also knew Darlene, and he knew that Darlene knew how Gerald thought. And sooner or later, Darlene was going to start asking the same question that had begun forming in the back of Thomas's own mind the moment he'd opened that hull. Why the boat? The letter went into a metal lockbox that Thomas kept in the floor of the hall closet, behind a box of winter gear. He drove into town that afternoon and had 2 conversations, one with a bank manager about a safety deposit box, and one with an attorney whose name a veteran at the VFW hall had mentioned once as someone he could trust. 3 weeks later, Darlene called. She started with small talk. How was the drive? How was Cooper? Had he gotten the boat to float yet? She laughed at that last one, but the laugh had an edge to it. Then, I was talking to Keith and we were thinking, Gerald's accountant reached out. Apparently there's some question about where the sale proceeds from the timber business went. Like, from back in the 90s. The accountant said the records just sort of stop. Thomas was quiet. I mean, I'm sure it was invested somewhere, Darlene said. Or donated. You know how private he was. But Keith thinks maybe there's more to the estate than what Patterson had in the file. And if there's more, well, it should be shared, right? Fairly. The will said what it said, Thomas replied. I know that. A pause. I'm just saying. If there was something that didn't get included, something Gerald might have overlooked, then it wouldn't really be covered by the will, would it? It would just be estate property. Thomas said he'd think about it. He didn't need to think about it. He needed an attorney, which he already had, and he needed patience, which the army had given him, whether he'd wanted it or not. Darlene filed her claim 8 weeks later. The paperwork alleged that Gerald Guthrie had intentionally concealed a significant portion of his estate at the time of will preparation, and that any such assets were subject to equitable distribution, regardless of the will's stated terms. Her attorneys were polished. Keith had hired well. Thomas's attorney, a quiet woman from Knoxville named Claire Osman, didn't seem worried. She asked Thomas a series of careful questions over 2 meetings, reviewed Gerald's letter, and then spent a week pulling records on the timber sale, the transfer of the boat's registry, and the timeline of every step from Gerald's death to Thomas's discovery. The letter is the anchor, she told him. Gerald made his intentions explicit. The boat was legally transferred to you through the will. What was inside the boat was part of the boat. Will that hold? Thomas asked. We're going to find out, she said. The courtroom in Knoxville was formal and quiet, the way courts in small cities sometimes still are. High ceilings, old wood, a procedural seriousness that felt appropriate. Thomas wore the same shirt he'd worn to the will reading. He sat at the table with Claire Osman and kept his hands flat on the table in front of him and his face still. Darlene sat across the room with Keith and 2 attorneys. She didn't look angry. She looked determined, which was harder to read. Darlene's lead attorney argued that Gerald Guthrie's intent had been unclear, that the boat's contents had never been formally inventoried or disclosed, and that equity required the assets be distributed among all surviving family members of the estate. Claire Osman stood and presented Gerald's letter. She presented the boat's chain of title. She presented the testimony of Patterson, the estate attorney, who confirmed that Gerald had been of sound mind and deliberate purpose at the time of will preparation. Then she said something Thomas hadn't expected. She called Thomas to the stand. He answered questions for about 15 minutes. The opposing attorney tried to suggest that Thomas had somehow known about the compartment before the will reading, that he had positioned himself to receive the boat. Thomas answered everything in the same flat, unhurried voice he used for everything, because it was the only voice he had. He described finding the boat. He described Cooper. He described the morning he opened the hull. The judge asked one question directly. Mr. Guthrie, did you take the boat because you expected to find something inside it? Thomas thought about Gerald's cabin, the carport, the gray hull in the winter light, Cooper sitting down in front of the stern and not moving. No, ma'am, he said. I took it because it was his, and he left it to me. The judge studied him for a moment. She ruled 2 days later. The bequest was clear and legal. Gerald Guthrie had the right to dispose of his assets as he chose. The contents of the boat were physically and legally part of the inherited property. Thomas Allen Guthrie was the sole rightful owner. The gavel came down. Outside the courthouse, the April sky was pale and wide. Thomas stood on the steps for a moment and let the air hit his face. Cooper was at the bottom of the steps, leash held by Claire Osmond's paralegal, and the dog came up immediately when he saw Thomas, pushing his head into Thomas's palm. Thomas scratched behind his ears. "That's it, boy," he said quietly. Darlene was somewhere behind him, probably still inside. He didn't turn around. There was nothing useful in that direction. He walked down the steps. That fall, a gravel road was graded into a stretch of farmland in Harlan County, Kentucky. Land Thomas had purchased in the spring, at a price that was fair to the seller and didn't call attention to itself. By winter, a main building had been framed and dried in. By the following spring, it was complete enough to open. He called it the Ridgeline Center. It was built to serve veterans from eastern Kentucky and the surrounding counties, men and women who had come home from wars recent and less recent, and found that the country they'd returned to had not spent much time thinking about what they'd need. The center offered counseling, job training, housing transition support, and a working kennel program in which retired military dogs were paired with veterans suffering from PTSD and anxiety disorders. Cooper served as the model and mascot, limping through the facility on his uneven back leg, with the dignity of something that had already proven itself. Thomas ran the place with a small staff and a board of advisors, most of them veterans themselves. He didn't put his name on the building. He didn't talk to the press much. When a reporter from a Knoxville paper drove up to write a feature, Thomas sat with her for an hour at a folding table in the main room and answered everything directly and briefly, and then walked her to her car. One evening near the end of the center's first full year of operation, Thomas sat on the porch of the old trailer. He still lived there, had never replaced it, watching the light go down over the pines. Cooper lay across his feet. A few miles down the mountain, the lights of the Ridgeline Center were just visible between the trees when the angle was right. He thought about Gerald, about a man who had sat alone at the end of a table at a cousin's wedding and left before the cake was cut, about what it meant to work for 30 years and trust no one with what you'd built until the very last moment, and then to trust it to a person, not because of blood or proximity or habit, but because of one specific thing you had watched them do, without knowing they were being watched. Come home from a war and not ask anyone for a thing. Thomas looked down at Cooper. The dog's eyes were closed, his breathing slow, and even in the cooling air, Thomas hadn't asked for any of it. Not the tour, not the injury, not the quiet years in the trailer, not Gerald's boat sitting gray and broken in a carport in Sevier County. Not Cooper sitting down in front of the stern and refusing to move. He hadn't asked. But here it was anyway. He thought that was probably the thing Gerald had understood, that the people who don't reach for things are sometimes the ones who should be trusted to hold them. The pines moved slowly in the evening wind. The lights of the center glowed faintly through the trees. Cooper opened one eye, looked at Thomas, then closed it again. Thomas rested his hand on the dog's back. It wasn't the boat that had changed everything. It wasn't the money. It was an 8-year-old Belgian Malinois, with a tremor in his left leg, who had stopped in front of a stern transom and sat down and refused to leave until someone paid attention. If you're watching this right now and you believe a loyal dog can change a person's life, drop a 1 in the comments. And tell us where you're watching from. Your city, your state, wherever you are. These stories travel further than we ever expect, and it's always something to see exactly how far.